Cool. So I'm going to sort of launch into give an overview. I'll try and look for you to what the PowerPoint. But I thought I'd start by trying to frame what sort of problem are you trying to solve here. The problem we've got is that analytics at the moment very complex and fragmented. I'm sure you've seen diagrams. We've got some of these in your workplace. There's too many products, there's too many boxes, there's different vendors, managing different systems. It's all fragmented and complex. You know, it doesn't matter what sort of icons you use. You've got firewalls, you've got networks, you've got storage systems, database systems, ETL tools. All very complex, and integration of all these different systems is hard. And then if you look at the potential possible vendors that you could pull things from, I don't expect you to read all of these, but this is sort of the wall of choice you're being faced with at the moment. And then you've got to try and figure out, does this integrate with that? Apparently the sound's not great. That would be because I don't have the power on. So, so hopefully, is that better up the back? Yep. Yep. Switching it on makes a big difference. So yeah, that was an integration problem between myself and the sound system. So integration is hard. So they're sort of saying, yep.
That slide. Can you make?
I have no idea. Sorry, I don't. The question was whether I can make a readable version available of this slide.
I don't mean right here, but just for us after the session.
Yeah,
useful resource.
It's actually pinched from someone else's deck, so I don't know how high res the image is, but
I think can the deck be available afterwards?
Yeah, or even a readable version of it, but it probably might scale up. But yeah, I can make the deck available afterwards too, so you can try.
Thank you.
So yeah, so we're talking about trying to integrate all of these multiple systems and join them together, and how do they integrate? You need different experts in different things. So one of the quotes that our corporate vice president that's in charge of Fabric likes was, he was talking to a chief data officer, and the guy said, I want to be the chief data officer, not the chief integration officer. The data is the asset, not the integration. So that was just, integration is just a means to an end. I need to get my data asset, you know, in a usable sort of state. So as Microsoft, we say, great, we've got you covered. We've got products that cover each stage of your sort of analytics workspace. You can buy out and you can go and get ADF, you can get Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks, Data Factory, Synapse, Power BI. We've got all of these products. So you can build a complete analytics pipeline covering each of those different pillars that you need to be a complete analytics workspace. But it's still far too complex, even within Microsoft. Integrating our own ecosystem gets difficult. There's too many products. You get different experiences from one product to the other. Some of them are proprietary, so the data is locked in place in those. Others are open. Some are dedicated, some are serverless. We've got platform offerings. We've got software as a service offerings. There's different business models. How do you buy this stuff? You know, some you have to go into Azure, some you go to, you know, M365, some you go into Power BI itself. It's got steep learning curves. You need expertise, and the effort of integrating them is very high. So that's why we went out and built Fabric. Fabric's built around these four main pillars. It's designed to be the complete analytics platform. So everything's unified, everything's SaaS. You purchase Fabric licenses or Fabric capacities, and you've got everything you need. It's secure and governed. Then we've built it around a lake-centric and open approach. So every time when an organization opens up and purchases Fabric, they get OneLake. So OneLake is our lake storage system, and every tenant has one of those. All of your data is stored in there and accessed through Workspaces and other things. That enables this thing that we call sort of, the marketing term is one copy. So you can import your customer table and have that in one place, and you can shortcut it and share it between other things. You don't need to duplicate data in multiple places. It's also open at every tier. You can bring in data from external sources. You can integrate Fabric with other tools. we're working at empowering every business user, trying to make it familiar and intuitive, building off the success of Power BI and sort of taking that user interface and model.
How about Dataverse?
Yeah, Dataverse, we're looking at integrating as well. So there's we're looking at doing sort of a real-time replication from Dataverse to Fabric, so that you can access Dataverse data.
Yeah, so there's a shortcut for Dataverse shipping soon
I have
as
heard
well.
about coming from a dynamic side.
Yep. Yep. And we're sort of working in the same sort of fashion as we work with Power BI. Power BI gets updates every week, and Fabric will get incremental updates every week as we go. Yeah, so the question is, will we have something similar to Synapse Link in Fabric? And I believe that's the same. Amanjeet.
Yeah, no, I was gonna just add so we are going to ship Dataverse shortcut, and behind the scenes it's essentially using let's say ADF pipelines and things of that nature, like similar to Synapse Link, but more of SaaS, what do you call form factor. And that will basically just copy once you enable it, it'll automatically bring the data from Dataverse into Fabric. So that should ship soon.
Yeah, so that sort of Synapse Link Dataverse is Synapse Link into Fabric is something that we're working on. So Amanjeet's come from all of us have sort of come from one of the different technology stacks into Fabric. So Amanjeet's come in from sort of the Synapse family of products.
Yeah.
Phil and myself have come from the Power BI family. Did you want to add something, Amanjeet?
No, I was going to say I'm more from the Azure side. Synapse just happens to be one of the services. But yeah.
Yeah, so you've got the similar to the way you can work with Power BI. You can embed Power BI models from Fabric into Office. You can embed them in Teams. You can embed them in PowerPoint. They link into Outlook. All of that stuff's familiar. You've got the familiar Power BI workspace experience. So hopefully that'll help people speed up. Yep, that's a question. So often with a lot of the, so just to repeat the question, what was the open at every tier point referring to? So often when you've got sort of different technologies, they can lock the data into a proprietary format. So if you were to load data into a SQL server, you can't read the raw SQL files with Spark. You have to go through the engine. Everything in OneLake gets written to the Delta Parquet format, which is an open standard. And so all of our engines can read this Delta Parquet format. And if you've got some other tool or a Python script or Databricks, you can read those same files without having to transform the data or go through another compute engine. So the data stored in OneLake is open, community standard format. Yep, question on the side. So I'm not sure if I got the start of that. We're saying in Power BI we've got Pro and Premium. Were you asking what do we need to have to use Fabric? Yeah, so Fabric's built around the premium capacity model. So you purchase a capacity and then you can run all of your workloads on it. I'm actually wondering I might suggest that we hold some of the questions because I've got more slides that might answer things exactly like that. So I might keep powering through and then Phil can start on his demo. So if that's all right, we might hold questions to the end.
Yeah, we'll have a dedicated session at the end for questions.
We're really interested in answering them, but I think some of the slides coming up might answer some of the questions people have got. So we'll keep powering on and then we can get to Phil's demo. So, and the final one is we're looking at baking AI into the platform so that you can use these not to do your work, but to accelerate your work. So you can use ChatGPT and you can get AI to assist you in what you're doing. So what do you get with Fabric? You get a single onboarding and trial experience. You get a single sign-on, single navigation model, single UX. You've got workspaces. You've got a single data lake. The single data format, I've already touched on that, the Delta Parquet format, which is an open standard. That single data copy then will work across all the different engines. We're actually working on a single security model that's not part of the preview at the moment. You get a single CI/CD, so we're getting Git integration, which Phil's actually got as part of his demo. You get a single place to monitor all of your jobs. There's a monitoring hub. There's a single data hub where you can see all of your data, and you've got one place now with all the data's in Fabric to govern and work with your compliance. So the key to this is really OneLake. So this central open data format where you can store all of your data. And then on top of that, we can have all of these different engines that access OneLake. I think I've already touched on before, that gets automatically provisioned with a tenant. There's one of them. You can't then go and have two OneLakes. But then all of your data assets, your lakehouses, your data sets, your data marts, your data warehouses, they all store data in your tenant's OneLake. And then on top of this OneLake data store, we have our serverless compute. So all of these engines now have been separated from the data. The data is a separate storage layer and a separate compute layer. So you can run your Data Factory pipelines and they connect serverlessly. It's not easy to say quickly, through to your OneLake. So if you're used to using Python, you can use Python notebooks to do that. Access that data. You can access the same data through T-SQL with a Synapse data warehouse, or you can use a Power BI report and hit the same data stored in your OneLake. As you can see, I've got ahead of my build here, so Spark can read through data in your OneLake. You can use T-SQL, so if you're familiar with T-SQL, you can use that experience to access your data. It's the same data. If you're used to real-time analytics, you can use KQL. If you haven't played with KQL, it's definitely worth having a look at. It's part of the, if you go into Azure Data Explorer uses this KQL language. It's very good for streaming. It's very good for large data sets. It's a bit different to SQL, but it's a great language once you get used to it. And Power BI itself can also hook onto the data stored in OneLake. And you can see this, that's the magic of that works because all of these engines now know how to talk Delta Parquet. So what's hopefully coming soon is a service called OneSecurity that will sit over the top of your lake. So this is not part of the preview yet. This is a feature that they're madly working on completing the coding for at the moment. But this is going to enable you to set security in one place, and then doesn't matter which of the engines you use, that security will be respected. So you can set, you better set table level, column level, row level security, so granular security, and the engines will all respect that. So we often hit people at the moment that use Power BI in direct query mode because they've got security in their SQL layer. So they don't want to import the data because they don't want to define the security twice. But with OneSecurity, you can use any of the engines to access the data in Fabric, and it's protected by that one layer. So since this is the Power BI user group, hopefully you guys are familiar with the fact that Power BI has two storage modes. We've got direct query mode, which effectively takes a DAX query from one of your visuals, will transform that into one or more SQL queries, go through the compute engine, so it'll fire off to SQL, and SQL will evaluate that and return results back. So that's real time, but often slow. The other mode we've got at the moment is the import mode, where you'll take a batch of data, import that, so load it up into memory in Power BI, and then you get really fast queries, but you've got that delay between loading the batch up into memory. You've got that periodic load. Now with Fabric comes a third mode. So we're calling this direct lake. So what this enables us to do is they've effectively taught Power BI how to speak directly to Delta Parquet. So when you write a DAX query, it doesn't go through any engine. You can see the data warehouse there sort of dotted out. It directly reads the Delta Parquet files, because the Delta Parquet files use a columnar format, very similar to the Vertipack engine's native format. So they've coded what we call a transcoder, and Phil's going to run through that in his demo. So finally, part of the thing we've already had a question on it was the what does the open at every tier mean? So we sort of recognize that most people have already got a data environment of some sort. You've got your data stored somewhere. So you're probably not going to have like a brand new tenant. You're going to have an existing Power BI tenant. So how would you then migrate that into Fabric? So at the moment, you can just continue with your production workloads in Synapse or Azure Data Factory or Azure Data Explorer or Databricks. You're going to be able to mount those existing data assets into Fabric. So just connect them, wire them up, and then over time you can look at migrating stuff into Fabric tooling as and if that makes sense. So finally, at the moment, Power BI, with the exception of the direct lake, which is still in preview, is NGA. Everything else in the middle column there, Data Factory, data engineering, data science, the Synapse data warehouse, the real-time analytics, are all in public preview along with OneLake. Power BI Copilot for DAX, that used to be the natural language DAX thing that's been rebranded along with the whole Copilot thing, is still in public preview. And in private preview, we've got a feature called Data Activator. So if you've got time at the end, we've got a video about that, but that's a brand new piece of technology that allows you to take action over your data and define rules based on the nature of that data. So it's sort of like a Power Automate at an enterprise scale. So I see changes coming in the temperature of packages, which is one of the demo example. You've got IoT data that's monitoring temperature of packages. If I see one of those spike, I can send an email, or I can wait for a group of them to spike and then say, hey, this truck's been sitting too long. And we've also got private preview at the moment running for Microsoft Fabric, the Power BI Copilot, so you can type out some sentences about the type of report you want to build, and the Copilot will go and flesh out a report for you. And so that's the end of the PowerPoint. So now we get to the exciting stuff, and Phil's going to take over.
Oh, that was exciting. That was really good. So hopefully that gives you a really good intro about what this new thing called Fabric is. It's something we've been working on for quite a few years now. We only really just announced it this year, but behind the scenes, because it's such a big product, we've been doing a beast. We've been squirreling away. This is partly why some of the features you may have wanted in Power BI have taken a bit longer to ship than we normally take, because we have been quite busy. But hopefully it's worth the wait. So I'm just going to share my screen. Now, I'm using an Azure Virtual Desktop, which probably gives me this black bar at the top, which I haven't quite figured out how to get rid of, but doesn't matter. So, Fabric. How do we get into it? I'm just going to type in fabric.microsoft.com into the address bar. Assuming I've already gone through the process of setting up an account, I'm going to land on the Fabric homepage. Now, Darren might have touched on the idea of personas. We do this in Power BI. In the Power BI team, when we think about building features, we think about the kinds of people and the kind of roles they do with Power BI. We're taking that across to Fabric, because there'll be people in Fabric who never touch Power BI, as in they don't create a report. What they do is ETL, they do data engineering. There'll be a different set that just work on modeling, machine learning. There'll be others that all they do is create reports. They work in the Power BI canvas, for example. So straight away when you arrive in Fabric, you've got a choice of persona. Now, don't worry, if you pick the wrong one, you're not stuck with that, because what you can always do is click down here in the bottom left-hand corner and jump between them. But for some people, they get to work, they need to put on their data engineering hat because they're going to do ETL type work in the morning, and then in the afternoon, they're going to take off that hat and put in their Power BI hat. What does it actually mean? It means when you click on this, it's customized and guided to offer you experiences, artifacts, things to help a person who's really working in that space. Because the reality is, if we didn't do this, there's just too many things to choose from. So this just is designed to help that. Now, another thing about this particular page is if you scroll down a little bit, there's a really good link at the bottom here called Read Documentation. That's going to open in a new browser. And this is a really good starting point to find out a lot more about Fabric, including hands-on demos. And I know this particular web page has got a lot of content still coming. I myself have written 12 articles just on DirectLake, just on a storage mode. It's in the process of being going through technical writers at the moment. That'll be up shortly, but I know a lot of people have got a lot of content which is going to light up here. You know, guidance, tips, best practices, all those good things. So you can get there from the Fabric endpoint. So what I'm going to do though is come back here and say, I'm starting from scratch. In this demo, I want to go and work with some data, and I want to go right through to the end, creating a Power BI report, all in Fabric. So what does it actually look like? What are the kind of things you can do? So I'm going to start with my data engineering persona, because I want to work with data first. I need to get data to the point where I can model it and run some reports over it. And hopefully a lot of this is quite familiar, but this is the point of this demo is so you can see how it works in a inside the Fabric. The other thing I'm going to point out before I get too far is everything I'm going to do tonight in my demo is all going to be in the browser. So I'm not even going to use Power BI Desktop. I'm not going to use DAX Studio, which breaks my poor colleague's heart, because Darren here, if you've ever used DAX Studio, Darren here is the main contributor, basically the owner, author of that. And I'm not even going to use his fantastic product. That's not to say you won't need to use it. It's just for tonight's demo. A, I'm in a virtual desktop, which won't let me install it. But B, it's also neat to show that if you do happen to be on a Mac, or you do happen to be in a Linux machine, or you want to work in a way that you don't want to bring a billion rows down to your local laptop machine because you're in rural broadband, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why, hey, if I can do all this up in the cloud through the web browser, then that's fantastic. So I'm going to go to my notes because I'm just don't want to make sure I forget anything. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do, like Power BI, your journey with data, your journey with projects, all start with a workspace. Everything sort of works inside the workspace. So I'm not going to create a Power BI workspace because in Fabric, it's called a Fabric workspace. So I'm going to go over here, click on Workspaces and say, I want to create a new workspace. And I'm going to call this AKL user group. Nice and bold. And I'm going to scroll down a little bit and just make sure that my workspace is being created in the right place. I'm going to put this on a premium capacity. It's going to be in the East US, which is where my premium capacity is in this demo tenant. And there, I have a workspace. It's empty. It has no data. It has no artifacts. So the first thing I want to do is provide access to my colleagues. So like with Power BI in my workspace, I can go to Manage Access. I want to add people or groups. And I recommend that you work with groups as opposed to trying to individually add and remove people as they leave and move into your organization. And I have a user group called Fabric Roadshow. And the only members of this group happen to be Darren and Amanjeet on the call. And I'm going to make them an admin of my workspace so they can contribute, and they're going to work alongside this, build this project with me. And I click the back button. So I've created my workspace and I have given other people users. If anyone who doesn't get access to my workspace cannot see anything inside it. So you've got quite good workspace level security that you can use as a mechanism to control who can see what, or importantly, who can see things they shouldn't, prevent people seeing things they shouldn't be able to see. All right, so now I want to start bringing things in. So inside Fabric, data needs to belong to a lakehouse. So I need to create a lakehouse. You can have more than one lakehouse per workspace. And obviously, you can create lots of lakehouses in other workspaces. So I'm going to go here to the new button. And I'm not going to zoom in, unfortunately, because the zooming experience is not great in my Windows virtual desktop. But the artifacts that it's offering me are ones that are probably interesting and most likely for a data engineer. But lakehouse is probably going to pop up in most of those. So I'm going to click on lakehouse, and we're going to call this AKL lakehouse. Okay, cool. And this is going to do a couple of things for me. It's going to create a SQL endpoint to that lakehouse. That's going to give me the ability to run T-SQL queries against data when I bring data into this lakehouse. It's also going to create a default data set, which gives me the ability to run DAX immediately against data we bring in. But the other thing I'm going to do, before I go too far, and this is probably something of interest to the developers amongst us, but should also be interested to people who aren't developers, just to at least know it's there. So I'm going to go to my workspace, and I'm going to connect it to Git. And I'm going to show you how easy that is. So over here in Azure DevOps, I'm going to create a brand new project. So this is starting from scratch over in Azure DevOps. So I'm going to call this AKL DevOps. And those that have used Azure DevOps know that there are probably a lot of things you can customize and configure at this point. I'm just going to go with default and say, let's just create this project. And once it's created, I can go into the project and create a basic repo. And I'm going to go to repo, go down here and click on the initialize button. It's as easy as that. Okay, so now I've got over in DevOps somewhere where I can check in my artifacts. Now, not all items in my workspace work with it. Generally, the idea is things that involve code. So notebooks, which we'll create one. Power BI datasets, Power BI reports, pipelines soon. But it means that every single time I make a change, I can potentially check that in, which gives me the ability to revert back if I do silly things. But equally, if I delete an object, like I delete my notebook, how do you recover that today in Power BI? Well, you don't have notebooks, but you know what I mean. At least with DevOps, you can go and just simply use it as a backup restore mechanism. And I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like. So I've created my repo. That was really easy. I'm going to go back to my Fabric notebook here, and I'm going to connect my workspace to that repo that we just created. So here on the left, we've got Git integration. And this actually exists in Power BI today. But with Power BI, you could only do some artifacts. With Fabric, you can do a lot more artifacts. So I'm going to connect to my project. I think I just need to refresh the page so that my workspace can be aware of that. So I'm just going to go back to my workspace settings, click on Git integration, and my organization is me, and the project is not showing up. There it is. I just had to not rush. The Git repository is there. I'm going to connect to the main branch. You can get more sophisticated this when you're familiar with it. I'm going to click on the connect and sync button. A couple of things have happened to this workspace now. Got a brand new button up the top here called source control. That's going to give me an indication about whether things are checked in or not. We've got a new column over here called Git status. And at the moment, the only 3 items in my workspace aren't items that I can put into source control. But as I build out this demo, you'll see things that do work with that. And in very, very small down the bottom, there are things I can click on in the status bar that can tell me at any given point in time what's different between what the state of the items are in the workspace now and compared with back in Git. So we'll come back to that. I just wanted to make sure I had that turned on. So now as I start working with the data set, you'll see things happen. So let's go and get some data. So as I mentioned, data needs to exist inside a lakehouse. So I need to click on the lakehouse, and I'm going to go get data a couple of ways. There are quite a few ways you can get data. The way I'm going to focus on it for this demo is I'm going to use a pipeline and a data factory pipeline to move data into our lakehouse, but I'm also going to create a shortcut to data elsewhere. So that data is going to stay in its original location, and I'm not going to physically duplicate or clone that data in my lakehouse. So let's go and do the first mechanism, which is just get data. And I could use a Dataflow Gen 2. I could use a Spark notebook. All of these work, but for this demo, I'm just going to click on a data pipeline. So this is, if any of you have used Azure Data Factory, you'll recognize it. So I'm giving the pipeline a very original name, Pipeline 1. And here you get the pipeline canvas, and this is going to initiate a copy wizard where I can specify where do I want to go to get data. And with a pipeline, you've got quite a rich array of sources that I can choose from. I'm not going to dwell on them. Tonight, I'm going to be using an Azure SQL database because I've got some AdventureWorks data, which is quite small, quick and easy to move through, so you get the point. But the pipeline, we've got an example of an internal set of Microsoft Sales data that was 20 terabytes.
Whoa.
It can transfer when you configure it right, about 15 minutes to get data into Fabric. That's probably when you pay for the top tiers and do some things, but you can get it running. Probably a lot of stuff happening in parallel there. I'm clicking on Azure SQL database. I'm going to go to my connection string that I've already set up. Click next. This is going to connect to my Azure SQL database. I only want to grab the first few tables, which are a handful of dimensions and a fact table. I'm going to click next. It automatically knows, hey, because you initiated this pipeline from this lakehouse, that's where I'm going to default the destination to, but you could easily put it to another lakehouse somewhere else. I can configure mapping, and I'm going to save and run that. I've just got one more button to click, and that'll kick off the pipeline, which is the activity of physically bringing data into my lakehouse. Now, a couple of things here. This might be one place that you do your ETL work. So this might be how you connect to your data source. And while I'm going to keep my pipeline canvas pretty simple here, one simple copy task, you could have an all array of activities, all with when you succeed, go here, when you fail, go here. And this could end up looking very sophisticated. You could have a pipeline that calls another pipeline, but you could also have a pipeline that calls a notebook. And then you could have notebooks that call notebooks. So if you've got a very sophisticated ETL requirement, then absolutely you've got the ability to spread that either fully inside a pipeline or fully inside a notebook, or a bit of a mix, depending on where your capabilities, skill set, preferences arise. And that's actually succeeded. That's copied. Now, the other thing that's happened here is because I've used the Fabric service to bring data into Fabric, not only have we created a Delta table, which stores its data in Parquet files, but it's applied something called vOrder to that, which is an extra special level of compression that you only get with Fabric. And I'm going to probably spend a bit more time talking about that soon. But what that does is creates smaller, more efficient files, which use up less space, but they're also faster for running queries. Very, very important. And I'll remember why, but I've automatically applied vOrder to my files here. Okay, so we've got data physically in our lakehouse. The other thing I want to do is in my lakehouse is I'm going to create a shortcut. And I'm going to create a shortcut. The reason why I'm creating a shortcut is because the table I'm connecting to has 1 billion rows of data. And I don't want to even spend a couple of minutes copying that over, but I still want to run queries against it. So I'm going to go back to the same button on the toolbar called Get Data, and I'm going to click on New Shortcut. Now, I've got a couple of places I can choose. Naturally, I can create a shortcut to other Delta tables in lakehouses inside Fabric. That's a given. That makes sense. But equally, I can create a shortcut out to ADLS Gen 2, which is still in Azure, but it does need to be in Delta format. But I could also create shortcuts to Amazon S3. And that means I can run queries against data without over an AWS, without even needing to bring it into Fabric, which is kind of cool. The speed of that query is going to depend on factors like the round trip latency, the capability of the other end, but also things like vOrder. The lack of vOrder is going to have an impact. However, if you write your query, depending on the size of the data, it might come back fairly quickly, or if it's a really big set of data over in Amazon, then go and make a cup of tea and come back, but it'll succeed. And you could use that shortcut equally to just simply copy stuff. So what am I doing? I'm going to go to OneLake because I don't have an AWS account. I'm too cheap, and I have this 1 billion row data here in this lakehouse, which is in my tenant. And I'm going to just connect it to, and the file name has 1BLN in the name, and create. It's as easy as that. Now remember, I'm not moving any data about at this point. All I'm doing is it's showing it up as an item here in my list of lakehouse delta tables. And what is a lakehouse delta table? It's something I can run queries against. Below that, we've got an area called files. I can store all sorts of things in there. I can store images, logos, CSV files, all sorts. It can be used as a lakehouse. The difference between files and tables are tables are things that you can run queries against from any Fabric service. What's a Fabric service? DAX is a Fabric service. So Power BI can run queries against tables. I can write T-SQL and I can write Spark, and I'm going to do that very shortly. So now that I've got data in my lakehouse, there's a couple of things I can do. I can open OneLake Explorer. Normally on your machine, if you download OneLake Explorer, it sits in your File Explorer. So it's a Windows thing. So normally when you open File Explorer, you see your OneDrive personal, your OneDrive work, your local C drive and bits and pieces. So it'll just be another node there that sits alongside called OneLake Explorer. And when you expand it, you can drill down and find the actual files and see how they exist and copy to and remove and clone and do all those sorts of fun things. But I can look at the files up here as well. So this billion row table that I created a shortcut to, I can say, just show me those files here in the web. And this is, I know this particular table has got a billion row spread. The engine Fabric has decided that I'm going to use about a dozen Parquet files to store them. Each of these files is about 500 meg, so half a gig each. So I know this table that I've just created a shortcut to is about 7 gig of data. And we're going to query it in a bit. And I think you'll be impressed about how fast we can run queries against this data set that I haven't even copied in. Sorry.
It looks like there's no quick visual indication that you're looking at a shortcut rather than.
Oh, good question. So is there a visual indicator to differentiate tables that are based on shortcut versus tables that are actually physically reside into the lakehouse? Yes, there is. I'm going to try and zoom in. There we go. I'm going to try and zoom in again. You might notice in the very top left-hand corner of that icon, there is a link. That's how you can tell the difference. Personally, I prefer something with a bit of color as well. That might come. But yes, at the moment, that's the only way that I know of that you can tell the difference between what is a shortcut file and what's not. But performance-wise, if it's in a lakehouse and it's got vOrder, it shouldn't matter. Whereas, yeah, maybe if it's out in ADLS Gen 2 or AWS or one of the new features that new locations that we'll add, that might become a bit something you want to be aware of.
Probably need to buy our designers some low-res monitors.
All right, so let's query this stuff. So as I mentioned, now we've got data. We've got 5 tables, 4 physically and 1 shortcutted into our service. I just want to have a look at the data. I want to run some queries against it. There's a bunch of services I can choose from. I'm going to try out Notebook first because I've got a button here called Notebook. So I'm going to say, let's create a new notebook. And this is an item that I can check into Git. So straight away, this is going to create a blank notebook connected to my lakehouse. And remember, I gave access to my Fabric colleagues at the start. So if they're quick and they go into my workspace, they will see this notebook created and they can actually go into it. And you might even see them pop up here while I'm doing some work. But the work I'm going to do, I'm going to click on the customer table, say load data into Spark. And that's giving me a cell here, already in the syntax of PySpark, where I can run a query against that table. But immediately below that, we can see Darren running around. We can see his cursor. We might even see Amanjeet in Sydney. Now, we could be in completely different parts of the planet, all collaborating and building something quite interesting and special. And if I run this, my output will turn up. Here we go. Amanjeet's turned up, and he's going to do some interesting things. I'll just take over this cell. Okay, fair enough. Amanjeet, if you can hear me, why don't you type in snippet and see if you can bring up some interesting code I need in my workspace. So if you just type the word snippet, and that
There you go.
he might not see it actually. He's probably going to get a context menu with a bunch of on how to quickly add some code.
Is there any specific one you want me to try in my cell?
No, just anything. Darren's done something below. I'm running my top 1,000 code. Darren's doing some output, so you can see the collaboration element. Looks very much like Excel. You know, we're all editing Excel at the same time, but here we're actually doing it in the same work environment, which I think is pretty neat. It might be really annoying, but you could probably block someone out. I don't know.
I think you're all literally on the same
Yep.
page.
And I'm going to click the run button on the code that Amanjeet has just put in, and there's the code. So while they're there, I'm going to jump back out to my workspace. Stay in there, Amanjeet. I'm going to go back into my workspace, and my notebook now is showing up as git status uncommitted. That means it's compatible. And that means now when I click on the source control button up here in the top, and I say I want to check that in, it's going to check it in based on exactly as that state right now. And it's going to say on the screen there that it is now in sync. So if I go back into it, and if I make a change, or if anyone makes a change, so we're going to make the color, rather than make the color green, let's make the color red. So it automatically saves. You can turn that on or off. If I go back out to my workspace now, it's telling me it's synced, but if I pause for a couple of seconds, it should hopefully say this is now uncommitted. There we go. I can put that into source control by clicking the button. I don't have to write cryptic command line and remember a whole bunch of things. I can just go check that in. Now, Darren could create a brand new workspace in this tenant now. He could go new workspace, and he could wire up that workspace to the same project I created and pull all of these items down. All that would appear at the moment would just be the notebook. But when we add other things, if I actually go into my repo and say, show me the commits that I've done, I've made a couple of commits, including one just now. I can click on the commit, and we can see things like what before and after, and we can revert. And this isn't just for notebooks. This is for Power BI data sets, and now Power BI reports. So if you create a report, and I'm going to do this, and make an adjustment like you bump a visual or you change some text, this will all be fully, or this is now all fully supported with Git on your items, and more Fabric artifacts will work with this too over time, which I think is pretty cool. All right. So now we've got some data. We want to model the data. I want to create a data set. So I'm going to go back to my lakehouse, and I'm going to create a Power BI data set from the lakehouse. And normally you might go to Power BI desktop and say, I want to start building a data set here. But now with Fabric, you can still do that. I'm going to go back to my lakehouse and say, let's create a new Power BI data set. And it's going to offer me all the objects. I don't have to use all of them. That are visible in the lakehouse. I'm going to say, let's bring them all in, confirm. And what we're going to see next is the web authoring or the web modeling experience. So here, I'm going to be able to, within my browser, define relationships, create some measures. I don't get the full set of functionality that I get with Power BI Desktop, but we're working on that. We're going to, over the next year, you'll see every month or so, more and more things light up. But the view here should be familiar to you. It's the same web modeling view that you're used to seeing over in Power BI Desktop. But of course here, I could be on a Mac or, again, I'm not bringing this billion-row data set down to my data, down to my very slow laptop. So I'm going to link up my relationships, so product key to product key. And I'm going to link up my date dimension and my customer dimension. So customer to customer. And there's no save button in here either. So every single time I perform an action, it's resaving back in the desktop. So if someone is building a report off this now, they'll actually, every time they rerun their visual, they'll get results changing while I'm building the data set. And finally, this guy here. And click OK. And I'm going to add a measure. Working on it. And I'm going to say new measure. And this new measure is going to be called sales. And that's just going to be the sum of sales amount. And OK. And I'm not hitting the save button at all here now. Let's have a look to see what this looks like back out in the workspace. Because I've just created a custom data set. It's given me a default name, which I can rename. We've got a custom data set called AKL Lakehouse 1 in parentheses, and it's uncommitted. So if I commit that to my source control and go back in and say make a change to the relationships or make a modification to the measure or add a new measure, then it's going to go back to uncommitted state, and I can decide the cadence that I want to synchronize. So that's the notebook and the data set working with Git. So now
you like a Power BI gateways, like on-premise gateway?
Can I use Git with Power BI on-premise? Yes, you can now. So I think what you mean by that is creating a folder on your local machine and connecting it to my Azure DevOps and making a clone of the artifacts down on your machine, making modifications and synchronizing them back to DevOps. Is that what you mean? Yep.
You know, in Power BI, when you create your connection to a SQL database, you can make a connection to a gateway, to an on-premise gateway.
Oh, gateway, sorry. Yes. Let's come back to that, because let's say we'll park questions until the end. Great question, but I sort of want to try and get through this fairly quickly. So I've created a data set, but I also want to show you, we ran a query against our data in the lakehouse from the notebook, but I want to show you how we can run T-SQL queries against it. So when we created the lakehouse, we also got the SQL endpoint turn up in our workspace. So if I click on the SQL endpoint, I get a browser-based web experience where I can run T-SQL queries against that data. So we can see the same tables, but now I'm in a world. Let's say I've written and learned a lot of T-SQL. I can say, select top 100 star from ADW dim customer and run that. And I can have queries that join tables. I can have obviously tables that join queries that do inner joins to shortcuts and shortcuts that point out to completely different systems. So I can write T-SQL against AWS, even though the AWS data is in Parquet format, and Delta, it's got no knowledge about T-SQL. We do the magic where we can allow you, if you're familiar with running SQL, to do that. And I can create views. I can do a lot of T-SQL things here. I just wanted to show that because we immediately could start running queries in PySpark. Now we've got queries in T-SQL. The next thing I want to show is running DAX queries against our data set. But I'm not going to use Power BI Desktop, and I'm not going to use DAX Studio. I'm going to use a notebook to run DAX against it. So I'm going to jump to a different workspace where I've got a notebook with some pre-set up stuff. It's using a new Python library called Sempi, which we're going to be releasing in about 2 weeks, that allows you to connect to a Power BI data set. It actually allows you to do a whole bunch of things to Fabric artifacts. But one of those things is to run a DAX query. The first thing I need to do is actually connect to the lakehouse because I was connected to something that I've since deleted. So I'm going to add a lakehouse. And what I'm showing you here is a notebook in a different workspace being allowed to connect to a lakehouse somewhere else. So I want to add the lakehouse that I just created about 20 minutes ago. And I need to click on something here to be able to say, this is the one I want my queries to run. And I'm going to get the Spark session running. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail, but Sempi is a Python library that you can add to. I'll clear this because it's still got stuff from last time. Sempi is a Python library you can upload to your Workspace Spark sessions.
What do you use?
Sempi, S-E-M for semantic, S-E-M-P-Y for Python. So it's a Python library that you can load to your Spark. It's probably quite hard to see. But it's built by Microsoft, it's built by us, it's built by our engineering teams. It's the same team that own the notebook world. And it's a whole bunch of helper libraries and objects designed to do things with Fabric. So one of the blocks of code here just simply list all the data sets in a workspace. You can list the measures, you can do all sorts of things. This is still starting up. It just takes a little bit for my Spark session to start with this private preview version of Sempi. But once it's started, I can start running some things, such as that data set I just created. I can get a graphical view of what the relationship diagram is. But importantly, I'm going to start running queries against it. Before I run a query, I'm going to run a DMV against the data set just to show that nothing is in memory. Then as I run queries, what's going to happen is we'll be able to see what's getting loaded into memory by Darrent Lake as it's running. So my Spark session started, so I can do things like, hey Sempi, give me a list of all the Power BI data sets that are in that particular workspace, for example. And there's going to be an output here, but I could equally store that into a data frame or put it into a more persisted data storage like a Delta table, for example. Doesn't seem to think I've got one loaded. I'm just going to try this again. I might not be connected to the library I thought I was connected to. I'll just get that fixed quickly. Auckland Lakehouse, pin that. Stop now. Yeah, I think I was still connected to an older dead one. So if I restart my Spark session, which seems to take about a minute or so. But remember, we talked about Darrent Lake. So what is Darrent Lake? It's a storage mode that you can use in place of direct query and import. But it works, columns get imported as you need to. So when you create the data set, it's completely empty of data. There's nothing in it. And that's what I'm going to show you with the DMV when I get it up and running, that no column has any data loaded. Then when I run a query against it, what's going to happen at that point is the data set's going to reach back out to the lakehouse. It's going to interrogate the Parquet files, and it's going to get what it needs and pull that into Power BI. This is what we call transcoding. It happens very, very quickly. But when it arrives back in the data set, it's going to stay there. So if I was to immediately run the same query, the data set will say, have I got this data already in memory? Yes, I do. I'm just going to process the query. I'm not going to go back out to the Parquet files. But periodically, there might be a reason for that data, that column data, to be evicted. Maybe the data set hasn't been touched for a couple of days. We'll evict the data set. But then when you come along and start running queries, we don't load the entire data set back in from the Delta table. We just grab the columns that are needed. So it's like on the fly, dynamic. We just load the columns that we need. I think this is run. I'm just going to try this again, see if I get an error. But hopefully this will make sense if I can get this. Running out of time. Well, time. Cool. The fact that it's taking this long is suggests that we might see the same error. All right. Cool. All right. I'm in the right place. I can see. I'm not going to zoom in, but it's telling me that there is one Power BI data set in the data set that I'm connected to. That's the one we just created. We haven't created any Power BI reports yet. We've just created a data set that has no data. Let's get Sempi to show off a little bit about what it can do. So let's plot a relationship, and I can run this. Not very many lines of code. And here's what I just created. And there's lots and lots of Sempi functions which probably deserve their own session in their own right once we officially release it. But just look out for it as the main takeaway. So I'm using now SEMPI to run a DMV query against that data set. Now, the purpose of this data set is it's going to give me an output. The output is going to be 1 row per column in any table in that data set. And in that result set, it's going to tell me, there's going to be a column that says, you know, is the data resident in memory? What's the temperature of it? If I minimize that and scroll down, and I'll try zooming again. Okay, so there's a bunch of columns. Is that going to move? No, I'll zoom back out because it's not that good. This has been recorded, so you can go back and catch this. But there's 1 row per column in the model, and these columns here tell me if any of these actually have data in memory. And you can see by false, 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 not a number, not a number, not a number. My data set is empty of data. And that's not what I expected because I've only just created. Now I'm going to scroll down a little bit and I'm going to run some DAX. You don't need to know line by line, but I'll describe what the query is going to do. It's just going to simply give me the sum of sales. This is the measure I just created, and group by product color. So when I run that, it's going to reach out. It's going to say, do I have the data in memory in my data set for the columns relevant to this query? No, I don't. I already know that. So for all of the columns relevant to this query, it's given me the result set already. It's going to reach out, go and grab those columns, transcode them, bring them into Power BI, and that's where they're going to live. So if I now go back to my DMV and rerun the same DMV to say, tell me the state of what's in memory, it's now going to say, you don't have to see the detail necessarily here, but there's 4 rows now, 4 columns actually have got some data in them. It's telling me how much space is being used. It's telling me the last time a query got run against those queries, against those columns. There's a temperature column which decays over time. So there's a lot of useful things that you can do with this DMV to help work out over a long period which columns might be good for actually completely removing. But if I rerun that exact same query right now, it doesn't need to go out to the Parquet files. It doesn't need to do that transcoding step. So it gives me effectively import-like performance, but you saw how quick it was to bring in. Now, maybe the reason why it was so quick to bring that data in was simply because these demo data sets are tiny. You know, there is only a couple of 100,000 rows in the fact table in this example. Now I'm going to use that shortcut, the billion row data set, which isn't even in this lakehouse. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit further. I include it in my data set. And this is going to do a sum of the device ID column, because I know that there happens to be a column in here called device ID. And I'm going to click the play button now. And where are we? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there. That's the result. So that's how long it took. Now what it did, when I hit the play button, my DAX query went to the data set, said, here's what I want you to tell me. And the data set said, okay, I'll just check to see whether I've got the column in memory. I don't, because we saw in the DMV. So I now need to go out to the lakehouse. The lakehouse tells me, well, I don't have it either. I've got a shortcut. You need to go over here. And I've gone over there, and I know from when I showed you the files before, that's about 7 gig of files spread over a dozen files. We went into each of those Parquet files, probably in parallel. We knew how to go to the right place. We got just the column we needed for the device ID column. And we've physically copied all of that data through the shortcut, transcoded it up into the data set. It's now sitting in the data set. So if I rerun exactly the same query now, it's not going to do any of those steps anymore. It's got just that column in memory.
Instead of the same one, could you do a different function, say average?
Yep, I absolutely will. I'm going to run the DMV now first, though. I'll come back and I'll change it, because there's a couple of things we can do. We can do average on the same column. We can do average on a different column. So my DMV, where previously I had 4 columns in memory, going to be hard to see at the back, I know, but we've now got 5 columns in memory, including the device ID column from my billion row table. And it's telling me how much memory it's needing to store, when it got last query, all those good things. Okay, so the request from the floor was, let's change the DAX rather than say max. Let's go AVG, no, average, AVG. What's the DAX syntax for average? I hardly use that particular function. Well, Sam,
No,
tell
no.
us.
I use a median.
Well, don't start that conversation because I don't know if a median's a median, but
Medium or medium.
okay, so it's not AVG, it might be
Average.
AG. Otherwise, I'll just go max or min. I know there's average X. There we go. So that was practically instant because the column was already in memory. Billion rows of data, but it's still there. So let's pick a different column. So I'm going to have to squint here. Quantity this year. QUANTITY underscore this year. Now I know this isn't a memory. So I'm going to click the play button again. Let's just see how fast it takes to actually turn up with a result. Bang. How fast is that? That's yep. Now, how can it do this? Magic. The reason why we're able to do this is simply because of the nature of the way data gets stored in those Parquet files. In analysis services in memory, we've been storing data very similar to that format for many years, like 15 years. And so the effort to actually take data, if we know ahead of time that it's sitting in this Parquet file format in a Delta table, we can just lift it off our very fast premium SSD file formats and bring it into memory very, very quickly with little effort. If I was to import the same billion row data set with import, what do I have to do with an import process? I have to connect to it, and I can connect to a wide variety of data sources. I need to stream 1 million or 8 million rows of data at a time. I need to pull apart that data and put it into columns. I need to convert it to dictionaries. I need to encode it, compress it, do all sorts of things. Now with Delta, that's already been done. So, and with V-order, this particular table here has got V-order. If I tried to run this query on exactly the same size data in the same location that did not have V-order, it would probably take about 30 seconds. So that's a big reason, and I probably should set that demo up as an example. But yeah, so with Parquet, a lot of the hard work that previously used to happen or take place in import has been done in the generation of the Parquet file formats. The other thing to realize about when you are using this new Direct Lake file format is it only supports one source. You can only connect a Direct Lake data source to a Fabric Delta table. Because obviously when you're using data, direct query and import, all those good things you can still use, you've got a much wider variety of data sources, but there's a cost to be able to handle all those things that you need to be able to do to get into the right format. So if you think that looks too good to be true, it is true. But the reason why is because of the thought we've put into making sure we get the data in Fabric in the right format to make analytics and reporting run very quickly over very large data sets. And it's not just Power BI, it's Kusto, it's Spark, it's the SQL endpoint. So it all get the same benefit of being able to run so quickly over the storage. So that's kind of cool. So sorry, you had a question. Okay, cool, wonderful. So I haven't got too much more to do. I want to create a report. Why do I want to create a report? Because hey, this is a Power BI. I don't want to go here. I want to go Workspaces, and I want to go to my Auckland user group workspace. And I know what I want to create a report because I want to show you working with Git. So where's my data set here? Here's our data set that we created. Now I'm a terrible report writer. So anything that helps me, and I'm really excited about the full-blown Copilot stuff that's still being worked on at the moment. We don't have that to show you here today, apart from video if we have time. And you can do this today actually, and not even in Fabric, but you can, on a data set, go auto create report. And when you do that, it's going to have a bit of a pass over the metadata of your system, and it's going to give you a fairly good first stab at a report, certainly far better than I might do after several hours. And this is only going to take a few seconds, and it's just going through saying your report is ready now. Let's have a look to see what that is. I've got a bunch of KPIs across the top and a couple of other nice reports that are laid out, and that's not a bad start. I can take this over and tweak it and customize it. There's even a smart narrative down the side there. And if I go save a copy, I don't want to save a copy. I just want to save it. Actually, this one doesn't auto save, and I'm going to call this AKL report and save. I'll jump back out to my workspace. The reason why I wanted to create that report, because at the top now, we've got a Power BI report, but the Git status is uncommitted. So I'm going to click source control, like I've done several times so far today. It knows what's changed. I'm going to commit that change, and I can put comments in, and I can do some fun stuff. I'm now going to go back into my report, and I'm going to break my report. So that's worked. I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to say, yep, I'm cool with this change. I'm going to bump my visual out of where it shouldn't be, and I'm going to make a change to a title, and I'm just going to say save. Because what we've done under the covers is the Power BI report now is broken out into a series of project files. It's a bunch of JSON documents that describe a lot of things about the visuals now. And when anything like that is in text, it makes it much easier to manage using a source control tool such as Git. And hopefully my sync button is going to change to be uncommitted, which it has done now. I'm going to synchronize that. And we're going to go OK. And the very last thing I'm going to do, no, there's one more thing after this. I'm going to go into my Azure DevOps. I'm going to show me the commits. I've got quite a few more commits now. And when I commit on the most recent one, in the report.json file, I can click on this, and side by side, I can scroll up and down and find what changed. I can revert. I can do all sorts of fun things that you can do with DevOps. But lastly, and this is the very last thing I promise, and then we'll go to Q&A. With Power BI workspaces, we've had for quite some time the ability to look at artifacts like this in a list view. But we've also had the ability to use a lineage view, which is a graphical flowchart with lines, etc., to show where does data start, how does what's connected to this data. That also carries through into Fabric. So everything I've done tonight in this workspace, which I've created from scratch, I'm going to click on the graphical view, and we can see that represented here. Again, it's very small, but over here on the left, we're seeing an artifact that represents the Azure SQL DB that I connected to bring data into. We can see a line coming into my lakehouse, and each one of these objects on my canvas has got an ellipsis that I can click on that gives me context-sensitive menus about things that make sense to do, say, on a lakehouse. Whereas over here, after my lakehouse, I had data go to my notebook, and my notebook here has got information about, recent runs and schedule, and I can do some things. Down the bottom here, we've got the data flowed into a SQL endpoint here, and it went into a lakehouse, and I've got a report here running off that lakehouse. Is my default one. So that lineage view is powerful, and it actually spans across workspaces too, because I can click on some buttons here like you can with Power BI and say what's impacted by the SQL endpoint elsewhere. And this is quite a helpful report, both in GUI, but there are APIs that you can get access to this information too.
You mentioned about if you deleted Notebook and Power BI,
yep,
you can look at reverting.
Yes, there's a couple of, okay, so the question is about how do you revert? Now, I'm not a DevOps expert. This has been shown to me once, but inside DevOps, there's a very easy way to revert one step. If you need to do more of that, you can create branches inside DevOps. Another option, which is one that makes sense to me, is I can just go and create another workspace. Let's say I've deleted this object, but I haven't made a commit. I can create another workspace and clone the data down, and I've got like the data as it was at the last commit, and I can bring it across depending on the type of object it is. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can use that DevOps. So it's quite a powerful tool just to turn on, even if you're not really a development shop, just to get that ability to back up. But hey, there's probably some good reasons to get familiar and used to using DevOps. And hopefully the way we've implemented it here means you don't have to be a real hard developer to get the best out of it. So we can go Q&A now. So you had your...
I'm not sure if I read it wrong, but people
Okay, so the question I think is the table I created a shortcut to, does that appear in the lineage graphical view? It doesn't look like it. It should appear here. There is a button that says show impact across workspaces. Child items and downstream items. It doesn't look like it. 2 workspaces. That's probably because I used the other one, but no, I'm not too sure. Sorry, it doesn't look like it based on the current output. That might come. So
Yeah, it's only. I was just going to say.
yes. Okay, so the question is, I believe, when I run a DAX query against the Power BI data set, it needs to bring, it goes, have I got this data in memory? And it doesn't, goes and grabs it, goes into memory. It might stay there for an unknown amount of time. There's a bunch of reasons why it might get bumped out of memory. One is just simply a lack of use. So if you create a data set and you don't query it for a couple of days, then the chances are we'll probably just evict it. But there are also scenarios like if you're busy querying, if there's memory pressure starting to grow in your data set, we can start evicting individual columns, which is quite a helpful, useful thing, because it means, unlike a fully import data set, you have to have all your columns in memory at any one point in time. Whereas here with Data Lake, we can drop columns in and out of memory as needed. So you can actually potentially have 40 gig of data running in a 25 gig space if you're happy for data to get paged in and out of memory. So there's a question at the back.
Yeah, I've got a question about this external data and type of external data I'm talking about, what might be called web scraping. Beautiful soup resulted type data. Does Fabric have any
Okay, so the
Microsoft things to easily do that? Yeah.
Okay, so the question at the back is looking at different ways or different external data sources to come into Fabric. One data source the gentleman's interested in is scraping web data. You know, does Fabric have anything out of the box to go? I don't think we've got a widget or a button that just says, hey, you can click on this to scrape web data. I do know that things like Dataflow Gen 2s have the ability for you to connect to web objects. I'm pretty sure that Python, because you've got notebooks, will have any number of libraries and functions and things that you can probably take advantage of.
You have to code deeply into the HTML. Just wondered if Microsoft has a more user-friendly way of connecting with web page data, whether directly.
Probably the closest we've got. So I think the question is, could we go in and maybe like grab a table? So if there's a public anonymously accessible web page with a table of data, you know, can you somehow connect to that as a source? My guess would be Dataflow Gen 2.
Yeah,
probably,
Dataflows can do that.
Yeah, Dataflow Gen 2, which is a Fabric service. And the good news about that is you could probably schedule it, and the output would also automatically apply vOrder. Hopefully that data set output is tiny, and vOrder probably doesn't matter at that point in time, but that would be my guess is the best way that you could use that. But you could also
ancillary to that, can you do it in such a way that streams? So when there's any change, updates.
Like to trigger activity? Not sure. There's a Dataflow Gen 2 question. You could probably schedule it to run every couple of minutes, just to grab the data, and then you could bring it into Fabric where you can test to see are there any changes since the last time we grabbed any data, and if there are nothing, stop there. If there are changes, merge them in. So I'm sure we've got a ton of questions, so I want to move them around. So yes.
How does it compare with Snowflake?
Okay, how does Fabric compare with Snowflake? Okay, Fabric is a very, very big eco platform. So Snowflake, when you think about Snowflake, what is it? Primarily, it's sort of like a data warehousing type service. We have a data warehousing service, but we've also got data engineering, we've got reporting and analytics, we've got data activator, we've got so much more. So what you could do is you could have Fabric run complementary to Snowflake. So you could, if you're using Snowflake today, you can continue to use Snowflake and then look at ways to get data from Snowflake into Fabric. We can't shortcut to that yet, but then you can use all of the other services in Fabric, or you could use it to replace Snowflake. It's up to you. You could do that for part or all of your data. Part of the appeal of Fabric is having everything in one place. You know, one bill. You know, we talked about the wanting to be a chief data officer versus a chief not wanting to be an integration officer. So in short, with tools like Snowflake, Fabric can work very complementary too, but equally can take the place of partially or fully. It's up to you. And I suspect you'll be quite impressed with the job that Microsoft does in that space, because we've been doing it for quite some time.
Can you explain the use of Copilot within Fabric?
So the question is, can we deeply explain Copilot within Fabric? Darren, I'm going to take a break from talking for a bit. So
yeah, I was just wondering whether we. So the concept of Copilot is sort of, Copilot's like a brand, and we're adding lots of different skills to the Copilots. So the first thing we're working on at the moment is a Power BI Copilot experience, where you can, it basically looks at your metadata, your tables, columns, measures, and you can say, give me a report showing the regional sales over time, and it can find columns just based on that.
And we can show a video of that at the end for those that want to stick around. We will play it.
Yeah. But we're also looking at taking that further then to, can it help you write SQL code? Can you help it with Python code? Can you explain, can you look into my data and tell me why sales increased last month versus the month before? So there's a bunch of other skills we're adding, but first step's going to be this Power BI Copilot.
Yeah, basically Microsoft spent $10 billion buying ChatGPT. And when we did that last year, the order just went out through the entire company. Use this, find lots of places to use that. So pretty much every internal conversation we were having for many, many months, it's like, oh, can we use ChatGPT? Can we use Copilots for this? And in a lot of places, it probably didn't suit it, but still in a lot of places, it's going to turn up. So I would say if you're looking in 6 months' time across Fabric, it's going to be there in many different elements, helping you write code, helping you create reports, writing decks.
Yeah. I was going to say, I did an example with Tabular Editor a couple of months ago, showing how you can write a script that would go out to ChatGPT, pass it your DAX, and then give you a business description of what that measure was calculating.
That you could save then into the model.
Save back into the model, and you might think, well, someone at Microsoft could probably build that into the product if they were smart enough.
But there's definitely a big push to see it appear in a lot of places. So.
Questions. First is just showcase that you use DAX query get results. Wondering within Power BI reports, are you also getting the same speed as Darrent?
Oh, so great question. So the question for those that couldn't hear, I showed in my notebook the speed of DAX query. Would I get the same speed from Power BI? Absolutely. And that report I created would have done exactly the same. So what I'm going to do is open that report, and I'm going to connect to a column that I probably didn't touch. So if I go to my Workspace and Auckland user group, and I'm going to open my report, and I'm going to drag a column that I didn't previously access. So my report is here. Okay, open report.
Possibly even find it's faster because it's not going through that lakehouse engine as well.
Yeah, so I'm going to edit this report, and I'm going to click on a new tab, and I'm going to go to my billion row data set, and I know that I didn't touch the quantity last year column. So I'm going to drag that to the canvas and let go, and this is transcoding and bringing it in, and it's going to give me by default sum of quantity last year, and that's how long it took. So that the time it took to do that included all that stuff I mentioned before, going out and grabbing, extracting data from those Parquet files and bringing them in. So correct. Yep. Yep.
Sorry, second question would be, is there compatibility with our platforms and the local?
So the second question, is there a compatibility with the Power Platform low code?
Yeah, like Power Automate and apps.
Well, we're all part, like Power BI still exists as part of the Power Platform, but in what specific compatibility?
I guess like trigger business processes or connect application data, API stuff.
Okay, so anything that you can do in Power Automate today, you can probably still do. I'm not strong in that area, and probably isn't, neither is Darren. I'm not
No,
sure,
but I think anything you can do with an import or direct query model will pretty much work in Direct Lake. So the client tool doesn't know the storage engine underneath. So if you were triggering a DAX query in Power Automate, it'll still work against the Direct Lake.
Power Automate data I and store that in a data lake and then run a report based on that data.
Yeah, there's probably a variety of ways that you could solve the same challenge, depending on the size of your data and all sorts. But yeah, I'd say technically, no problem.
Yeah, and the lakehouses expose an ADLS Gen 2 endpoint. So if you've got something you can write into ADLS, it can write into OneLake, and you can then presume as long as you can get into a table format.
It's in the red jacket. How was the cost? That took a while. We have a slide, I forget. I don't think we've actually announced anything.
No, so at the moment I think you can buy the pay-as-you-go F SKUs, but they're obviously they're similar to the A SKUs in Azure. So you're paying by the hour, but you're paying a bit of a premium because you can start and stop them at will, which is great if you've got a dev environment. Like I've got a couple of A SKUs I use for testing Power BI premium stuff.
Yeah,
but
I don't think we've actually announced what the capacity pricing is going to be. But one thing you do need to know is that it's going to use the same model as Power BI. So what you'll do is instead of buying a P1 premium capacity for Power BI or a P2 or a P3 or whatever, you're going to buy a Fabric capacity. And when you buy a Fabric capacity, you get all those Fabric services immediately. So you get X amount of compute. And if you decide to use it over here in Spark and some over here in T-SQL and some over here in DAX, then it's all covered by the same price. So you purchase, I forget what they're called, F64 or F128.
Yeah, F64.
And that will give you X amount of compute and X amount of like memory per artifact, that sort of stuff. Storage is unlimited, but equally you can upscale, you can get bigger capacities. The actual official price probably get announced formally later this year. Next month, we've got a very big event happening in the US called the Power Platform Conference, and then that's in October. And then that's followed in November by our flagship conference, Microsoft Ignite. So one of those, I think you'll hear, and possibly also something maybe happening in December. At one of those events, we'll get probably a GA and certainly pricing. But I suspect it'll be in the ballpark and range of what you get with Power BI today. But it will reflect the fact that you're not just getting Power BI, but you're also getting all this other functionality too. It'll be capacity based.
This is planning to replace Azure Data Factory, or is not being enough?
So is Fabric going to replace the Azure Data Platform? What do you mean by Azure Data Platform? Is that a product? Or?
The whole platform where you do your pipelines.
So no. So with that, I'm assuming you're saying like the Azure Data Platform is largely that set of PaaS products that we've got in market at the moment. So you can buy a dedicated pool in Azure Synapse, or you can set up Azure Data Factory. Those things will still keep running.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And if you like, you can mount those into Fabric, or you can transition to a Fabric capacity if you find that's a more efficient way of running. But we'll still be offering that PaaS, platform as a service-based offering, in parallel with the new SaaS Fabric offering. So you'll have a choice whether you migrate, mount, keep them separate.
And how this will fit into the certifications, because it's the PL300, which is the Power BI certification, and the DP203, which is the data engineer certification. Do you know where this one will go?
No, certification, that is a brand new question. I would expect, given that Power BI is our current sort of SaaS offering, that those set of certifications would be expanded, but I'm just taking a guess, and Phil's taking a note.
Yeah. I mean, Microsoft has run certification programs for a long, long time. I'm sure something is coming. It's just whether we continue to have the same, you can be certified in Power BI as a report author or a data modeler, all things that you have to learn a lot to actually be a professional in Power BI these days. And you don't have to know anything about notebooks or SQL if you don't have to. But I'm sure there might be some Fabric-based certifications that pop up too. But there might also be dedicated certifications for the other parts of Fabric as well, like Kusto, for example.
Just thinking, I would expect potentially persona-based modules could be one way we would go, but
yeah, my guess would be they'll exist. There'll be new ones. They'll I'm not quite sure when they'll pop up. Yes, sorry, Greg. So the question is, can I share a single report across multiple workspaces? So you can do a couple of things. You can actually just clone the report into multiple workspaces. Pardon? Oh,
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, so the way OneLake works is under the covers, we're managing a bunch of ADLS Gen 2 storage accounts for you. So when you spin up a capacity, you specify which region that's in, and any OneLake storage goes into those that same region. So the region requirements are handled by where you configure the capacity.
Although you're talking about multiple tenancies? Single tenancy.
Yeah, you'd need to create a capacity in that specific region. So even though we call it OneLake, there's multiple partitions of that under the covers, and so we can put data in that capacity in one region and other regions.
In fact, this demo sheet I've been sharing with you today has got two capacities. One's in Europe and one's in North America. I can just say, or I want my workspace to be in Europe. I can change it.
I just want to add there. I just want to add there that wherever you spin up your capacity, that's where your storage resources are provisioned. Look at it that way. So if you have a capacity in Singapore and you attach it to a workspace, that's where your storage is going to reside, basically wherever your capacity is.
So does that mean like capacity we get storage as well as those I was thinking just the buffer. So are you saying like we get storage as well?
I didn't get the question.
So, sorry, she was just asking if the, because I got the mic. So she was just asking if we get storage along with the compute for a capacity. So when we buy a capacity, does storage come with that?
No. So your capacity only includes compute. Storage is separate from it, but it's included. But you don't have to select any separate. You don't have to go through any additional steps to provision storage. If that makes sense.
So it seems like there are some similarities between the lakehouse object that was demoed and Power BI data marts, because they both seem to include a default data set. So my question was, what are the pros and cons between data marts and lakehouses for creating shared data models that you're using with both desktop and other tools? Or is our lakehouse basically like the better option now going forward?
So to repeat the question, just to paraphrase, make sure we've got it. What's the difference between data marts and
the lakehouse?
The goal is to create a shared data model that people can connect to both Power BI desktop and other tools.
Right.
Which, like, what are the pros and cons between lakehouse and data?
I would say a data mart is kind of designed to be a quick fire, low code, no code data warehouse. You don't have to click too many buttons to actually, or know much about ETL to get a data mart up and running. And you say you're a small shop, you don't have IT staff, but you just want to use Power BI and data marts. It's a very nice, elegant solution. Don't have to have a sophisticated setup. And that works fine. You can actually create a data mart artifact inside Fabric. So you could still use Power BI against data marts if that's the way you like to run. But you perhaps there's a top out point where data marts probably aren't ideal for larger data sets, in which case absolutely a lakehouse is going to scale in many directions much better than a data mart is likely to do. So they can coexist. If you're using data marts today, there's no reason to change. It's not like they're not going away. If you were to start a brand new project, absolutely, I'd recommend data marts for that low code, no code entry point. But if you've got, I think the data mart might start to run into scale issues when you've got higher usage or more users, or your data starts to grow, and then you're probably better off to consider doing the parallel operation using the other services that you've got available into Lakehouse. And you could probably do them in parallel, but it's hard to say what the absolute list of pros and cons are, because it probably does matter about like a lot of things around your data, your users, how you like to use it, what sort of transformations you want to do, if any. So, but the main thing is it's not going away. So if you've built up capability in data marts, if I go back to my Lakehouse in my workspace, sorry, I can add one here. I'm not going to save my change. I can go new object, and I think somewhere in here I can create a data mart. Where is it? There we go. And this will bring up, I gotta give it a name, build data mart, create, and this is all in Fabric. But I don't think a data mart will be able to output two Delta files. You sort of can just connect to it as the way you use data marts today. So I'll bring that down. Can't see, sorry.
Does it allow us to
Does Fabric allow you to use external tools like a tabular editor and DAX Studio? Yeah, so it uses the same mechanism that you have today with Power BI. So you need a premium workspace, and inside that premium workspace, you need to enable XMLA. And that can be turned on or off at the tenant level. I believe it can be turned on or off at the workspace level, but when everything's been turned on and it's okay to use, then absolutely. The one thing you need to look out for when you're using, say, tabular editor to make a modification on a data set is it breaks the web modeling experience. So in my demo, I showed creating a data set in the browser, and I was creating relationships and measures. If I go back into that data set now, I'll see it how it was. But if I go in and open that data set with Tabular Editor, there's a lot of functionality in Tabular Editor that opens up. Like I can create all sorts of extra things in there that just have not lit up in the UX in Fabric. But when I do make an update using Tabular Editor, then it marks the data set as being modified outside Fabric, so it's not confident to be able to use the web modeling experience again. So it's just from that point, if you're using Tabular Editor, the chances are that's probably your preferred tool anyway. By all means, you can use it and can carry on using it. DAX Studio works as well. That's my go-to. That's the place I love to live and can work. Any other XMLA, you can create your own XMLA tools. You can go to Visual Studio Code and create your own little tool as well. PowerShell, all those work as well.
Does it still publish when you publish the report? Will it still be in the dataset?
It does, yes. So the question is, what happens if I decide to use Power BI Desktop and then I publish my created data set to my Fabric workspace? Yes, it creates a data set, and it creates the report object as well. I'm not sure if you can open it in the web authoring tool. If you can't now, you probably can soon. You might be able to already. I could try it out, but I know I'm conscious we're running like late on time, and there's at least one video we want to share with you. So Darren and I are going to stick around for as long as, if anyone does want to come up and ask some questions. I think we've got one more at the front here.
Yeah, so 3 questions, 2 very quick ones, timing wise, and one less. You mentioned CMP is going to be released soon.
So on the 11th of September is when they're going to do the public preview. So there'll be documentation, place that you can download it, and they'll.
And you indicated shortcut to Snowflake? Is there like a roadmap timeframe around that?
I don't think I mentioned shortcut to Snowflake.
You said you think it's probably on the roadmap, or it's likely to come. Or...
Yeah.
Yeah, I might have got that wrong. Sorry. So good to check.
No, so if I may jump in, so shortcuts are mainly targeted at external file-based systems, so such as your ADLS, AWS S3, GCP, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure Storage, or how you got your on-prem NFS file system. So shortcuts are primarily targeted at that. So Snowflake is not going to be part of that. Having said that, we are working on features that would enable you to integrate Snowflake with Fabric in a frictionless fashion. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, so just because you can't create a shortcut doesn't mean you can't use data from Snowflake. You've just got different steps that you need to do.
Okay,
Yeah.
So likely to be available, not using the shortcut, but also not needing to import the Snowflake data.
The tool that Amanjeet's talking about that's coming will be a somewhere in between.
Yes. Okay. And so my last thing there was, I just want to pick up really early on. You mentioned grain versus column versus row level security. So that column level security is available in Fabric.
Okay, so it's a bit of a journey. As of today, what you can do is use Workspaces to decide who can see what in terms of entire objects.
Right.
Also today, you can go into the SQL endpoint and you can define object level security on a table. Now, object level securities, you can either see the whole table or not, and probably even columns. I'm not actually too sure on that one. But if you define object level security on a SQL endpoint, it means direct lake won't work. That super fast method of sucking data out of columns says security is more important, and I still don't have the bits I need to be able to guarantee the right people see this. So I'm going to do what I call SQL, fall back to SQL and go direct query to SQL. So that's right now today in the preview. But what we've got coming up is what we're working towards is called OneSecurity. And if I find my slide.
Right. Okay. So that's a whole security layer that's on the roadmap that we haven't
in the works
really used. But okay. So you've answered it well enough, I think.
Yeah. So I can't. My PowerPoint's not. Oh no, I'm clicking on the wrong thing here. There we go. Okay. So OneSecurity. So this is a little bit more down the track, and this is an upcoming feature that will give you fine-grained security that can be configured at the lake level. And the idea here is, those Delta tables I created that are central to all the Fabric services, you'll define security there on the Delta table, and then doesn't matter if you're querying in Kusto or Power BI or DAX or T-SQL, they'll hit the Delta table, and the Delta table will decide who are you, and what are you allowed to see, and that'll be row level security, that'll be object level security, that'll be the whole lot. So this is the feature you want to have a look out for. I mentioned those big events that are coming in the States in the next few months. There's going to be, there will be announcements there on timing and how it's going to get released, because it's probably going to get released in stages. This is absolutely something we have to get right. We can't rush this. It's got to be no room for error, but once it's done, it's going to be pretty powerful. Sorry, David.
Lucky last question. So you meant that was going to be almost my question. So you've set your levels apparently at your OneSecurity.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that it's better to have groups. Will that reflect later in what people can see for data when you've actually produced it in a Power BI report or something else later?
I'm not familiar with the individual specs, but I would say it'll mirror what we do with Power BI. So you define roles, and the role will have like filter logic, and then you can decide what members get allocated to that role.
I understand creating your or your artifacts and everything else at the early stages. I'm thinking, who can see that data when you have created it? Does that OneSecurity must pass on to something else, so therefore it can be refiltered to who can see it?
I'm not sure, sorry. No, because this is going to be quite a big part of
Quite
Fabric.
complex, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm saying there'll be many sessions just on this topic alone. But I highly recommend, if things like row level security are of interest to you, to keep your eye on the big events that we've got
Thank you.
coming up, where the actual team who are building this can give updates on where they're going with that. It's pretty critical. So I'm gonna share my let Darren share his screen, and we've got 1 or 2 short videos on the Power BI Copilot. So I
Is
think
everybody happy to stay a wee while longer, or what's?
we can take questions at the end. Don't worry. Yeah.
So we've got 3. So I've got the data activator and the 2 copilots.
Yeah, it's up to you. Yeah.
So they're about 3 minutes each. So if you've got 10 minutes,
Yeah. Well, certainly
we'll push play.
Share your screen and the sound and. But for those who have to go, thank you so much for coming. I hope you've learned a lot.
Okay, so this is our snapshot slide of data activator. Basically, you can look at data. It can be from Power BI. You can say, after my Power BI is refreshed, I want to look at certain things in my data. You can define rules over what things you want to catch. If one of those rules gets passed, say yes, this rule has been triggered. You can then define an action that's going to take place. So it can be Teams. You can fire an email message. You could trigger a Power Automate flow if you want. You can trigger an Azure function. You can have custom code. So this is probably best explained through an example. So I'm going to hit play and let Will Thompson explain it as soon as I get focus back on PowerPoint.
So in this scenario, we are a logistics company and we have IoT sensors that track our packages, our drivers, trucks, that sort of thing. And we want to be alerted in real time when the packages that we're delivering overheat. Now, I've already got some data that's streaming into Data Activator here. In this case, it's coming from Event Hub, but it could just as simply be observations we're making against a Power BI report or a data lake or data warehouse. I can see the events as they come in. Let's focus on the package delivery events. I see an event count at the top, and this is showing us the overall number of observations of events that are coming in. And then the event timeline is showing us in real time as the latest events get updated. Now, underneath that, we'll also see a table where you can see some of the details. So I can see the city name, the number of hours it's been in transit, and crucially the temperature column, which is what we care about. So we need to tell Data Activator, how do we identify individual packages? What does it mean for a package to be overheating? And then crucially, what do we do as a result of that when those packages are too hot? So the first thing I'm going to do is tell Data Activator, how do I identify a package? So we need this package ID column here. And we're going to create an object using that to get started. So now I can see for my object, I can say, let's come back and add these fields as properties. So I'm going to add this hours in transit property and add my temperature property, which we'll then use further. So see, those are on the left-hand side here. Let's create a measure on top of this. So the measure lets me do things like aggregating or smoothing out some of those fields. So I'm going to look at the maximum temperature every 5 minutes. Let's give this a name. And you can see what we're looking at here is a sample of 5 of those packages. But the selector at the top lets us swap and look at the others. And you can see there are thousands of packages that we're monitoring here. The system will scale up to support this kind of large-scale logistics system. So let's create a trigger now. And this is what actually checks the conditions, checks the thresholds that we care about. So I care about when the maximum temperature is greater than 80. And what I want it to do is send me an email when that threshold is met. So again, I can see the temperature values here, but underneath I'm actually seeing the number of times this condition would have been met over the last few hours. And in fact, underneath I can see the individual occurrences of when the threshold was breached. And if I select the last few of these, what I can do is test this system and test this action to make sure everything's wired up properly. Over in Outlook, I can see it sent me 3 emails with the object ID, the package ID, and the temperature that was hit when it went over that threshold. Now let's fast forward a little bit. Back here in Data Activator, I've built out this system a little bit more robustly. So I've got more objects and I've added more properties to them. I have things like a driver object on the left-hand side here with a trigger to tell me when somebody's been on their shift for more than 8 hours. And in this case, it's not actually sending me an email. The email's going to the appropriate city manager for that specific driver. So you can see in just a few minutes, I've been able to build out a real-time operational alerting system without writing a single line of code using Data Activator.
Cool. Yes. I think once you see it in action, it sort of, you go, hey, I possibly think of things I could do with that.
So this is a new capability that doesn't exist in Azure at the moment.
Yeah, it's currently in private preview. So as Phil said, keep an eye out for some of those upcoming conferences, and hopefully there'll be some announcements about that.
There's a few store apps that do something similar at the moment. Going for about 12 months, but
yep.
There, do it yourself. Bang, bang.
Yeah, and it's UI driven, define the rules, drag and drop. Yep. So this next one is an overview of the Copilot experience. So this gives us sort of a holistic overview, and the one after that I've got is specifically just a Power BI Copilot.
Next generation AI in Microsoft Fabric empowers you to unlock the full potential of your data. With Copilot integrated into every data experience, Microsoft Fabric lets you use natural language to bring your data to life. From integrating data to writing code, to finding insights and creating reports, new transformative AI experiences work alongside you every step of the way, so you can stay focused on getting value from your data. Copilot helps turn your words into data flows and data pipelines, so you can intelligently integrate data from anywhere. When writing code, Copilot automatically suggests code and entire functions in real time, and Copilot can guide you to create machine learning models to unlock insights in your data. Just by chatting with Copilot, you can visually explore your data to create stunning reports, discover insights, and summarize your data into easy-to-understand text narratives for sharing. With Copilot, you can turn insight into action with triggers that monitor your data and notify users. You can even create your own custom natural language experiences that combine Azure OpenAI models and your organization's data, and easily publish your creations as plugins. And with your data in Fabric, Copilot provides insights and answers everywhere work gets done. Most importantly, Microsoft Cloud runs on trust, which means your data always remains your data. Bring your data into the era of AI with Microsoft Fabric.
Yeah, so that's just sort of the big picture of where we see Copilots going, and a lot of that stuff's being coded at the moment. The one that's in public preview is the Power BI Copilot, which is the one we explained that looks at your metadata and helps build reports. So this is the last video. This is about another 3 minutes, and then we're done.
Let's take a look at how Copilot in Power BI is empowering everyone to quickly find and share insights. For example, say I'm a sales analyst for a hotel and resorts company. Now, with Copilot in Power BI, I can simply describe the report I want to build and get insights in seconds. Maybe we need a new report to help us understand the profile of our customers, to gain insights into what is driving return visits to our properties. I just describe what I need, and Copilot will automatically analyze my data and create a new report based on my needs. Immediately, Copilot created a new Power BI report that is fully interactive, and I can start slicing and dicing my data to explore deeper. Copilot added the charts and slicers I requested, but also conveniently gives me options to adjust the output to get just what I'm looking for. For example, let's switch to ask for metrics and trends and a slightly different layout. Automatically, Copilot updates the report. Let's go ahead and keep this report page, but it goes much further. I can also ask analysis questions such as, what are the main drivers for repeat customer visits? Copilot responds by adding a new page to my report and uses Power BI's built-in advanced analysis capabilities for finding key influencers for variables in my data. Right away, I can see that customers who purchase spa visits are the most likely to be repeat visitors, followed by those who rented sports equipment. I can easily explore Power BI's key influencer visual further to learn more. I can even automatically see the most significant segments in my data just by clicking. Now let's go back to the first page and finish up our new report. I'm going to ask Copilot to make it look like our existing sales dashboard. Copilot automatically finds and references the dashboard to adjust my report with formatting and layout to match. Best of all, I can still interact directly with the Power BI report Copilot has created. So for example, if I wanted to manually change this line chart to add the reason customers were visiting, it's easy to do with just a few clicks. Let's also change the line chart to a ribbon chart to make the data really stand out. Finally, to make the report even easier for my team to understand, I'm going to ask Copilot to add a rich text description of my data right inside the report. This narrative summary is fully dynamic, and not only does Copilot highlight interesting insights from my data, but it provides citations from where in the report the data was taken. This summary will update every time the data is refreshed, or people filter the report with new insights based on the data. And just like that, in seconds, I've created a report that would have taken hours or days to do manually. Copilot, built on top of Azure OpenAI, is truly revolutionary for how we empower everyone to find and share insights.
Exciting. How is machine and deep learning integrated to this?
Sorry, the question, how does
Machine and deep learning.
machine and deep learning? That's probably a better question for the team that are building this, but as I mentioned earlier, Microsoft purchased OpenAI for about $10 billion this time last year. And as part of that, we got access to a lot of knowledge around how to build large language models. And that's being applied by the various teams. I'm not particularly close to any of the development work, but there's this new large language model which is popping up around the place that can take a question, interpret it, break it down into substrate parts, and actually get access to vast amounts of other information. There's probably another complete session based on that, but we're not seeing it pop up just in Power BI. As I mentioned, it's popping up in many places throughout Microsoft and other companies as well.
So if it's using AI and LLMs for producing these, is there much of an observed problem with hallucination?
I'm not sure, sorry. No, that would definitely be a better question. So the question is, because we're using LLMs, there's in the news when you hear about it, if you talk to a Copilot enough or ChatGPT enough, it kind of goes off the tracks a bit or a lot, called hallucination. Is that a problem here? Maybe. I do know that there is a huge emphasis on internally with Microsoft with all this ChatGPT technology to use it ethically. Really emphasize, even just to make sure that there's no possibility that people can think they're actually talking to an entity that has thought. We try and make it clear that you're just talking to a Copilot or a
But I think they are using
machine and deep learning. You've showed us a lot of data analysis. Like say, if you ask the question like, why are people buying my product? It's a little bit different from, show me the monthly trends.
Yeah, and I believe the new technology that we've coming out with Copilot will do a much better job at a question like that than our previous attempts, because it's quite a fresh approach. It's a very new approach. Being able to ask a large language model a question like that, it can actually do a much better job at interpreting and understand what you're trying to ask. So therefore, it can make better choices about what to use to prepare its answer. Probably a better session. I'm not an expert in LLMs by any stretch of the imagination. I can certainly say as a user, I'm very impressed, not just with Copilots, not just with Microsoft, but other implementations of these large language models. But I could also say, sorry?
For instance, a regression is not an LLM.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm probably not the best person to answer your question.
was going to say, I think that's why we're focusing more with the initial release with the Power BI Copilot, where you ask it to do things with the metadata. So, build me a chart with a trend of sales. It can understand that sales, and I can find a sales measure, and you're saying I want a monthly chart, so I can find the date. So it's not having to interpret why is my sales increased, because that involves scanning through your data and maybe making projections, maybe hallucinating. So I think we're sort of starting baby steps, working with metadata and just helping you out a bit, and then we'll get deeper into some of that more. Yeah, I mean, we've got some of that, we build small data mining models for the, the key influencers visual. So those sort of things get built on the fly. Yeah, so do we need to create measures and relationships? So the answer to that at the moment, yeah, for this Copilot, I'd say yes, because you want it to be able to make use of those measures. This one's not going to build measures for you. We do have the natural language, which has been rebranded to Copilot for DAX, where you can type in, create me a 3-month rolling average of sales, and it'll go and suggest some DAX code, which you should verify works the way you want, in case it's hallucinated. But and there are like multiple ways. Like I've asked it to do a 3-month moving average, and it's done a daily 3-month moving average, not a three monthly buckets, but like 30 bucket or 90 buckets. Like it's done
you
daily.
could ask a human developer that, and they could build it.
And they come back with a different interpretation depending on how precise you are. Yep.
Can you show us how to set up?
No, it just reads that from your data set. So there's no extra setup.
Yeah, so when I created my data set before by dragging relationships and creating measures, that's there. That's the metadata that Copilot will use, but I won't use the data inside the model.
Is there a data governance?
A purview?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think, so does it use Purview to improve the metadata for the Copilot? I think it's self-contained at the moment, that it reads the data set. So if you push description things into the data set, it might be able to take those into account, but it won't reach out to a third-party service at this point in time.
So it would have to understand column names?
Yeah. And ideally, I would say your column name should be very user-friendly by the time you reach your data set. So I'd always say
quantity as opposed to QTY. And...
Yeah, because the language model will have a lot better chance of understanding English, or can understand multiple language, but it's being primarily tested and developed in English at the moment, which is good for those of us in the English-speaking part of the world.
Is it right to assume that, as it is the case right now with generative, describe what the columns are actually provide contextual data about the data using Copilot? That be possible?
Yeah, so the question for those, just checking this, there are still 20 online. Could Copilot be used to describe the columns in the data set to give you better context about them? It could probably, I don't know if we'd have enough information that we're feeding to it for it to give it that sort of context, because you'd really want to be able to sort of read the data and say, oh yes, even though it's a text column, this is actually a date of birth and there's date data in there. And so I think that's probably out of scope for this current release.
Is DAX performance driven?
I doubt it. I doubt it, because DAX performance tuning is quite a fine art, and you need to have access often when you are performance tuning DAX to things that the large language model won't see. Like quite often when I'm doing advanced performance tuning, I need to be able to run the query multiple times and look to see what's happening under the covers. What's happening in the storage engine, what's happening in the formula engine. And you can only see that when you're actually running the query over the data. And if you've got larger data volumes, it might make different decisions. So at the simply inspecting the DAX query itself, it could probably make basic suggestions, like don't apply a filter across the entire table when you can do it over a single column. But we kind of have that today with the best practice analyzer that you can get with Tabular Editor already. I think that's probably as much as a Copilot might be able to do also in for performance. But it just depends what you mean by that, because yeah, advanced performance tuning is quite an art form that you do need to consider a lot of things and run things in different ways. I'm talking very large data sets, concurrency, all the various flavors of fusion, totally a session on its own.
Yeah,
But I
process, right?
yeah,
Someday.
no, I'd say for a while, Copilot's probably going to give you a fairly good first stab at generally simple-ish expressions, time intelligence, running totals, child-parent comparisons, but you know, anything much more nuanced, it won't have other examples easily to be able to draw from. So, but I didn't want to make this about a Copilot session. The stuff for Power BI reports very exciting. We actually, as Microsoft employees, can go into our Power BI environments and play with the Copilot. So it's coming. It's not too far away. Unfortunately, we can't show them to you. Sorry?
It's not quite here yet.
No, it's not quite as slick as that, but it's not far off. It's certainly got a lot of attention and interest. So the pressure's on that team to deliver, and I suspect they will be required to deliver later this year. But as I said, we can use it now already with our own data sets, which is kind of fun and cool. So especially for someone who's an awful report writer. We haven't got an official date yet. My personal unofficial guess is probably later this year. And well, that's what I'm talking about, Fabric GA. The question will be what will be in GA and what won't be in GA. That's probably going to be the thing. I think we will need to deliver a GA this year, but just keep your eye very sharp on anything that drops in or out.
And we've got customers testing Copilot at the moment, so it depends a bit too on how they take the experience and how the feedback comes in, how much extra work the team has to roll in before they GA it. So
yeah, because if they find big things, then it's going to take more work to fix and take longer to get up. So, well, thank you very much for coming tonight. I know this is the first in-person session for a while, and first one for many of you. So we're off to Brisbane tomorrow to repeat the same session. So, and then Sydney, and then Melbourne, and thank you.
Thank you.
If you have a glass or a cup close to you, pick it up, put it out on the table outside, where they can. If you have to have a black bridge chair at the back,
I think I just.
That drilling is unlucky. Oh, that's all right.